Dog walk with it, rush war, I get it. No meds, no mind was assassinated. We been here, we committed. Tryna finish what they started and we made it. Great state I'm in all states I'm in. I might find a form in my melanin. Great state I'm in all states I'm in. I might find a form in my melanin. Great state I'm in all states I'm in. I might find a form in my melanin. Great state I'm in all states I'm in. I might find a form in my melanin.
Hey everyone, we're starting now. Thank you for being here. My name is Kirby Joseph. I am the Safe Outside the System Coordinator at the Audre Lorde Project. And I will be facilitating today with my lovely co-host, amazing organizer, Answer Coalition member, Aya. Aya, do you want to say a few words? Just wave hi.
Hey guys, what's up?
Hi. And I just want to get into the roles of everyone who's here, from the amazing ALP staff to our panelists. So today we have Rumi, who is a Trans Justice Program Coordinator. Rumi will be our vibe checker, just making sure everybody's okay, paying attention to the chats, if there's any accessibility needs. We're also gonna have Max, who is our co-director at the Audre Lorde Project, who will be letting people into the workshop as it continues on and being part of our safety team. We also have KDK, who is our membership and engagement specialist. I don't know why I said specialist. It sounded better with specialist in it. Who will be also monitoring the comments and keeping track of any housing lawyer rights questions that people may have that will come before our presenters get on to the program. And we have Jonavi, who is our comms coordinator here at the Audre Lorde Project, who folks in community may know as Tigma Sala, who will be doing all our tech support. So thank you so much, comrades, for being part of this webinar and helping it happen and making sure it's a success. Because of the amount of people that are going to be joining the chat, joining the Zoom, we just have a few ground rules that I just want to let people know about. One, this webinar will be recorded because we want to use it as a resource. New York City has graciously, all my quotes, extended eviction pauses to August 6th, but landlords are currently filing pensions against residents. And so this will be an actual resource that we will use for anyone who's not here to also learn about their housing, know your rights, and what's currently going on in the climate and what they need to know to make sure that they stay safe. So if you do not want yourself recorded, please make sure that you're off camera so your face won't be present. We want to respect people's self-determination and privacy if that is something that you would feel uncomfortable with. We want to also make sure that all communication for right now, until the floor is open later on in the program, is happening in the chat. We have, like I mentioned, Rumi, who's our vibe checker, and KDK, who will also be looking at the chat to see any needs that people may have. And we ask for people to stay on mute so people can hear the presentations. And also just respect people's stories and respect people's space and respect the space that we're in and that we have created here today. That includes how we communicate on the chat, and that includes what we say to each other out loud. Now that we got those ground rules out of the way, what we want to start doing is having everyone in the chat, and Rumi will follow. Hi, Imani. What we want to do is start this workshop, what we're here to talk about. And I want to ask everyone to put their name, introduce yourself, your pronouns, and one word or phrase or sentence of what housing means to you. So in the chat, if people can just start adding it in again, your name, your pronouns, and a word or a sentence of what housing means to you. And once we get a few going, hopefully as many folks as possible, Rumi will actually read those off. Again, the prompt is in the chat, putting your name, your pronouns, and what housing means to you. And Rumi, if you can just start reading some of those off for us, please.
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I'm Rumi. I threw my answer in there as well, and my pronouns are they and he, and kin is also fine. And I use housing. When I say housing, I'm just saying that it's a place to rest and recharge, in all the different ways that could mean food, spiritually, emotionally. We also have here KD, who will be receiving y'all's questions today, and they use they, them pronouns, and they said housing means wholeness. From Michaela, uses she, her pronouns. Michaela says, housing to me means a secure, safe, and stable place to grow and thrive. Absolutely. Moriah, I hope that's how you say your name. Moriah, she, her, hers. And she says, and to me, housing is health. Absolutely. Maxwell says housing is sanctuary. Thank you, Max. Star, she says housing means sanctuary and safe haven. Okay, okay. I'm seeing some other folks like Monica and Esteban resounding that housing definitely means safety. Edric is also resounding with safety and also to be able to belong. It's really important. I see Johnny also saying that housing means home, the base of family. Awesome. And I don't want to mispronounce your name. I'm sorry. I don't want to say Perrier. I doubt that that's how you say your name. I'm sorry if I butchered it.
It's Pierre.
Pierre. Okay.
That's right.
It's spelled differently than I know it. Sorry about that, Pierre. Okay, cool. He says housing is peace. Absolutely. Lorraine, she says that housing means safety and security and mental and physical health. Making sure that I didn't miss anybody after that. Vern says, they said that housing is a safe space. And then Dita says, housing is safety. She also says stability and a place to thrive, grow, and rest. Yeah. And Mariah is affirming, yes, all of these things, I assume.
Okay.
So, oh, there's more, but I will do you want me to read any more, Kirby?
Let's do 2 more.
Okay, cool. I see, I see Elijah. He says that housing means personal agency. And I'm trying to see if there's just a lot of resounding around safety. I like, Sophia, you also mentioned it means you have autonomy. Yes, snap for sanctuary. And Nat also mentioned that housing is where I'm most myself.
And so it's so interesting that when we talk about housing, number one, I just want to say creative space. We see you, Chris H. I saw you just pop in and added that. It's so interesting when we talk about housing that we collectively are thinking the same thing, that housing is supposed to be a place where you have stability, where you're safe, where you can be your best self, where you can be creative. But we live under capitalism. And so what we need and what we deserve versus the reality are completely different. And even though we know that housing is a human right, that means the second you are born, you deserve a place to live and to thrive, like folks are saying. This system actually thinks that you're disposable enough to not have it. And that's why this workshop is critical and is important why we're having it. New York City is a 2/3 renter city. And right now we're in a mix of a COVID crisis and a pandemic that this system has exacerbated. And newspapers have called this housing situation is gonna be an eviction apocalypse. And this is the stage that we're entering. So we know that even though we believe in housing, that the system doesn't care about our housing. It's something that is gambled with every day. I mean, we see it as our communities change. We see it as slumlords continue to attack us. But it has a long history. This housing crisis is not new. And so what we want to do is go back, not all the way back, but semi back in a short history to talk about housing within the United States. I want to repeat, this is a short history. It doesn't have everything, but it covers a lot of the things that has led to how housing looks in this country and particularly in New York City. So Jonavi, if you start the slideshow.
Awesome.
That's this, Kirby. And we're gonna start at 4. That's the Bronx, by the way, but we're gonna get there. All right. The first people to experience housing displacement were indigenous folks. And Aya, if you want to start.
Yes. So we wanted to start here because, you know, there was no homelessness here before 1492. So it's really important to start with this because not only did, you know, millions of people lose their homes at the foundation of this system, but there was also the imposition of capitalism and profit, which made housing a privilege and not a right, and made us all just accept this as a reality. But we're gonna see that people have struggled and that any housing that we have today has come from struggle, from resistance of indigenous peoples to, you know, the housing movement. So,
next slide, please. So here we have housing crisis in the 1930s. Now, I just want to uplift before I go here. In between indigenous struggle and the 1930s, we had slavery, the displacement and capturing of African bodies brought here for labor in the name of capitalism. We all know America had the ultimate come up from indigenous bodies to Black bodies. Reconstruction era was an era where the United States could have chose to do right by African Americans, and they chose not to. And millions of African Americans were completely displaced, sharecropped on land, and bamboozled out of a promise of reparations for housing, which they never got. I just wanted to uplift that period. We did not skip those 400 years. Just wanted to uplift that, okay. Going into the 1930s, and one of the biggest housing crises happened during the Great Depression, especially in New York City. And there was a big, big struggle during the Great Depression for workers being indigenous, Black, and poor white folks. And our community, LGBTQ comrades, have always been in that fight throughout history. Every struggle, we were there. Many folks on the front lines as usual, always putting our bodies on the line. And during the Great Depression, the chant of peace, land, and bread was critical within that struggle. And if you go to the next slide, in New York City, tents and shanty homes were called Hooverville. That's actually Manhattan in the 1930s, because people literally had no place to live. They made homes out of tin, out of cardboard, and stayed there. And relief came from the New Deal, but the New Deal actually stole from communist applications from the Soviet Union to apply to the United States. So things like housing rights, things like Social Security and pension were not within the mindset of FDR. Don't let history try to tell you that he cared about us. It was actually stolen from rhetoric that was completely opposite of capitalism to save the capitalist economy, which obviously led to mass homelessness in tent cities. Aya, for the next slide. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Yeah, the New Deal came out of struggle, and it came out of a struggle that happened kind of like now. Like there's 50 million people unemployed right now. And it was the same thing back then, and people, won the right to public housing by like literally stopping evictions and fighting and taking over buildings, and yeah, we didn't even have public housing before that.
Yeah.
People would live on the street. And we're gonna get into this more. So skipping a little bit to the 60s, which was, a time of where housing was really threatened with urban renewal and just like all these policies. And here we have the first coining of the word gentrification, which was in 1964 by sociologist Ruth Glass. And she said that it described what she saw in London. And the quote is, "One by one, many of the working class quarters have been invaded by middle class, upper and lower. Once this process of gentrification starts in a district, it goes on rapidly until all or most of the working class occupiers are displaced, and the whole social character of the district is changed." So yeah, it's still what we see today, and we're gonna see how that plays out in the 70s, especially in New York City, in the next slide.
So we have the 1970s, the resistance effort to destroy the Lower East Side homes to stop displacement. The Committee of Cooper Square residents, community organizers completed its own development plan for urban renewal area that including preserving existing housing and building new low-income housing. In February 1970, the committee convinced the city to adopt their plan and preserve their buildings. This was the first community-initiated plan to be adopted in the city. So in Cooper Square, people been over there, very progressive activist type of history. A lot of students who have gone to Cooper Square have that same activist energy that's carried on from the 70s. So this is when people came together and started piecing how they can live and create their own housing, which is something that we have seen within community, people talking about land and what that looks like and creating their own housing and creating their own space.
Word. So next we're gonna talk about the 70s and 80s in Brooklyn in the next slide. And so as you all know, probably know, the 70s and 80s was a time of great disinvestment, which caused, basically, it wasn't profitable anymore for landlords to repair anything. So they were in a concerted plan all over the city to basically let their housing get as bad as it can, but while still squeezing out rent from the renters, until the point where they could, destroy it completely and rebuild higher profit housing. So like much higher rises, or just new housing that they could charge more for. So we saw that in the Bronx,
Mm-hmm.
97% of buildings were lost to fire and abandonment. That was arsonists, like specifically doing it, landlords to get insurance payments. And it was also just systemic because those areas didn't even have fire department. Like no one even gave a fuck, pretty much. And the city government at that time cut the budget by closing firehouses in poor, predominantly Black neighborhoods, knowing that politically they could get away with these service cuts.
Mm-hmm.
And yes. Go ahead, Kirby.
Go ahead. Next slide. You're right. Okay. So what we start to see also in the 70s and 80s is an over policing that starts in our communities. And here is actually a newspaper clipping of a murder that happened in Boston, and the way that they used it as a way to start overly policing the community and changing its landscape and pushing undesirables out of the community, right? So now you have a quiet wake of the crackdown by the police in a combat zone, being that Black and brown areas are combat zones and undesirable neighborhoods. And that means that we need those neighborhoods to be overly policed, right? You need police presence to keep the peace, even though we know that police have never given peace. They come from the legacy of slave catching. And how gentrification has played out in New York City in the same ways, because capitalists don't really change their rhetoric too much. It just changed like, state lines. The same idea of over policing was something that was carried out everywhere, including Boston.
Word.
Slide.
Yeah, and let's not forget that the Vietnam War was going on, and they were seeing the same. He was using the same tactics of counterinsurgency. They were seeing like random people in Black neighborhoods as enemy combatants, just like they saw everyone in Vietnam as if they were enemies. And that's how civilians and like innocent people and poor people get killed by the government. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about, the policies that have led to the housing crisis that we have now. So in 1978, we have the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit, which is basically a tax credit to developers equal to 10% of the cost of a building's rehab. So, and also then it increased the maximum to 25% 3 years later. And basically this made it really easy for developers to take over old buildings and abandoned factories and warehouses, and renovate them and basically they would do it for a profit, like they would get paid to do that by the government. And in 2000, Congress creates the New Market Tax Credit Program, which incentivizes development in distressed census tracts. So when we say distressed, it means areas where capital has left, so they have no jobs there. There are a lot of just like decrepit buildings, and this revitalization is done on the backs of working class people, which is that the taxes that would come to that community do not come because they let people come in without paying taxes. So these two tax credit programs grow to leverage tens of billions of dollars a year for economic revitalization and housing projects, which also happen in factory buildings, like we said. And all these factories went to, China and other countries to make more profits, while the buildings themselves were also transformed. So it's a process in both areas, and it's all connected.
Yeah, and I just want to add before we go to the next slide that this was part of a practice, obviously, to try to diminish an eminent domain where empty buildings were used by homeless people to live. So instead of providing housing and creating housing, they would rather let the building decay and move jobs to global imperialism than provide housing and jobs for people who live here. Next slide. Okay, and I know we all know about this. In 1982, Broken Windows is an article that is published. In December 2017, the same magazine publishes another story detailing how those crime prevention tactics often begin showing up shortly before or after a neighborhood's demographic shift in ways of reflecting gentrification. So 1982 is when that word broken windows, and for folks who don't know, the idea of broken windows is, well, they're letting their neighborhoods decay because they want it to be that way. They being Black and brown people, by the way. Let's be clear on who the they are. And that will lead them to enter delinquent or violent behavior. And so we have to over-police those communities. And it again goes into the anti-Black, racist, xenophobic ideology that has always existed into the system. Because we know that's not true. And I don't know, Aya, if you want to add anything.
No, but I was just gonna say, like, please read this article. It's online, and it's actually wild. And that ideology, you know, is still exists, and people still defend it. If you read that article, like, it's really a white supremacist manifesto, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a way to justify the oppression of Black and brown people and bodies.
Yes, based on lies, based on saying, like, if you see one window broken in that neighborhood means there's, like, murders.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's a jump that it's just that reaching so far away. Anyway,
that's a whole nother webinar.
It is, right? We really had to. We can talk about it another day.
Yep. We see end of policing. Yep.
Yes. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, now we're gonna talk about art. So 1984, Pittsburgh officials and philanthropists established the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, which establishes a cultural district in the city, in downtown, and invests heavily there. And then this became a kind of example that was followed by a lot of other cities to create cultural districts, which is basically a way to gentrify areas and offer tax credits and incentives for development. And also, it doesn't support local artists.
Nope.
So,
who have always been on the ground creating art.
Exactly. Next slide.
California passes the Ellis Act, which provides landlords with a way of changing their rent control departments to market rate. Today, critics cite this act as a driving force behind mass evictions and gentrifying in San Francisco. Anybody who knows anything about San Francisco besides Full House, don't say Full House, I know y'all was gonna say Full House, knows that the mission in San Francisco is completely gentrified and wiped out. And 1985 was the ground where that process started to happen in San Francisco. 20 years later, San Francisco created a small sites program in 2014 for tenants facing imminent eviction from qualified buildings. The program provides low interest loans for nonprofit affordable housing developers to acquire the buildings that make market practice of previous landlords, allowing tenants to stay in the place. By 2018, the program helped save tenants in nearly 200 rental housing units across more than 25 buildings. Many of these buildings are in and around the Mission District, which I just mentioned, is considered the epicenter of the city's gentrification. And even though this nonprofit did this work, it doesn't help, obviously, the level that it needs to help in terms of people who have been completely kicked out of the neighborhood because of technology boom, Silicon Valley, and just the complete upsweep of wealth pushing that happened in that community. So next slide.
So in 1987, the LAPD begins arresting homeless people on anti-camping charges on Skid Row, an area of that city that is now, against all odds, beginning to attract middle-class condo shoppers. So once again, this is a process that started in the 80s, especially. We have to think about it in terms of how did this spread to the whole nation. Skid Row is really well known for that. And Like the police will have a whole unit just for homeless people.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to think about it. Like they have a unit for NYCHA, they have a unit for homeless people, they have a unit for like street vendors and whatever. Like they don't have units for like solving crimes and stuff. Like they have units for like different populations that they want to kill and prevent from surviving, because that's their main role.
And I want to add that the LAPD is the worst PD in the United States. Following that is New York, NYPD. And their budget is higher than the the NYPD budget. And the NYPD budget is $6 billion, and LAPD has more than that to oppress that community, including homeless people who live on Skid Row.
Or I can take the next slide.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, so this is a big thing for NYCHA and for housing and public housing in general. In 1992, HUD launches the Hope 6 program, which provided grant money from HUD to local housing authorities to demolish public housing and replace it with market rate housing. And fun fact, Governor Cuomo used to work in HUD during this time. First in some position in 1993, and then he was like the head of HUD under Bill Clinton when he was implementing this program. And now he's in charge of NYCHA, so you have to keep that in mind. And this program destroyed, it's not a fun fact, yes, it's a horrible fucking fact. So 200,000 public housing units were destroyed using this program. So when we think of, our elected officials, we have to think about what they've been doing, but also all of them are in this system. Like the reason why this arose is because the system, ever since, Nixon started a moratorium on public housing, then there were other ways to try to stop public housing. And this allowed for the privatization of public housing, which was a new way that they found, which would not only destroy public housing, but use that process to give their friends, the landlords, and the large real estate tax credits and incentives to both buy those lands and, lands around NYCHA and public lands in general, and then also take over the land of those public housing units that got destroyed. So in Chicago's public housing was completely decimated by this program. By the way, like almost no public housing exists there now. And 60,000 people lost their public housing in Chicago due to this program. And only 2,100 former public housing residents now live in the new mixed income developments that were developed out of this program. Yes.
And I just want to add in terms of NYCHA before we go to the next point, is that the police officer responsible for the extreme brutalization of Oblawima, Officer Schwartz, was actually appointed a position in NYCHA as a NYCHA carpenter making 6 figures. So you can be a police officer and brutalize a community that lives in NYCHA and then not face any repercussion for your action, and then get a job in NYCHA to watch over more Black bodies that you would have oppressed on your beat. So this shows how incestual capitalism is. Next slide. 1993, under the influence of real estate industry, lobbyists, New York State legislators passed into law several loopholes, including one that allows New York City landlords, this is very important, New York City landlords to flip rent-stabilized apartments into market rate apartments by gradually increasing the rent each time a tenant moves out until the rent hits a certain threshold, upon which the apartment loses rent-stabilized status. Because of this, over the next 15 years in New York City, loses more than 152,000 rent-stabilized apartments. So this right here is one, and Esteban and Elizabeth, you will talk to us a little bit about this. In 1993, this set the stage for what we know as destabilizing apartments in New York City. So we wanted to make sure that we pinpointed that and where that started.
Yes, huge incentive to evict everyone. Exactly.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Yeah, next we have in 1997, for the first time, a Manhattan apartment sells for more than $2,000 per square foot. And that was the maximum. That was a huge record. Today's average is $1,773
Per square foot. Next slide. 1998, the Faircloth Amendment is signed into law by Bill Clinton as an amendment to the Housing Act of 1937. This amendment banned the construction of new public housing units, which would lead to a net increase in public housing. And I don't know, Aya, do you want to add anything?
No, but just like this is the main reason why we have this crisis, because as we talked about, you know, all this public housing was destroyed, like over 200,000 units were destroyed. So let's say 4 people live in each one, which is probably not even true, like probably more. But that's like, I can't do math, but that's like 800,000 people losing their housing, and no new housing has been built. Not only that, but they chose an arbitrary date of October 1999 as the date of like the threshold of public housing that they had at that time cannot be increased, which means like a net increase is impossible. You have to destroy housing to build new housing, basically. And that's why we fight today.
2003, in a study, Brooklyn Heights Loretta Lees coins the term super gentrification. So it's super now, which defines as an intensified regentrification in a few select areas of global cities like London and New York that have become the focus of intense investment and consumption by a new generation of super rich financiers. Over the next decade, New York City planners rezone large spots in New York City. I know that's not what the word is, but that's what I'm gonna say. Adding density to mostly working class communities of color while limiting density in many already wealthy white communities in the city. This leads to a pattern of tenant harassment and displacement in working class communities of color that make way for large scale luxury development. So this 2003, there's a lot of people who have been organizing for a long time and will tell you that around this time is when they start to see the big shifts in New York City landscape, especially within housing. It became a very critical situation. And the last thing I want to say about this before we move forward is that as diverse as New York City is, it is one of the most segregated cities in this country, period. And we see it in our education, we see it in the breakups of our communities, and we see it very much so with housing and how our housing is maintained. And besides Robert Moses before, fuck Robert Moses, but besides him, this era really launched in the dividing lines of rich and poor. Go ahead, Aya.
Word, okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at time, so I'm gonna go through it faster right now. But 2005, as we all know, Hurricane Katrina floods New Orleans, and that was a pivotal event for real estate because they used that crisis to basically, you know, get rid of everything that existed. Like all the housing that was destroyed in that was never rebuilt for those people who lived in it. And that allowed for capital to basically regenerate itself, and for people to bear the brunt of that entire crisis on their own. So a lot of the Black residents of New Orleans were not able to get housing after that. And not only this, but this was used as a model. Like after this hurricane, a hurricane became an opportunity for capitalism. And so I'm gonna move to the next slide too, because it's related to Washington, D.C. also be losing its Black majority. We're just talking about, this is the time when gentrification really started to change entire cultural and historical traditions for people, not only affecting lives, but affecting literally things that people thought would never change, like Washington, D.C. being a Black city. Kirby, I don't know if you want to skip any because of time.
We can skip the next one and go right into 2006. Yes. No, actually, go back. We have to talk about RAD.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so go ahead and take on RAD, Aya.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just quickly, because it's the same thing as the Hope 6 program. So it's like part of HUD's entire strategy to privatize public housing. And so it was authorized by Congress. I just want to say that Democrats controlled the Senate when this passed. So I'm just saying, there you go. And it allows public housing agencies and owners of HUD-assisted properties to convert units from their original sources of funding to private developers. Basically, it just means that any housing authority can allow developers to start operating its buildings. And this was implemented in New York, in Ocean Bay, in Queens, and that they got so-called $500 million in renovation, which, they had like new hallways and like certain lights was working, that's it. And the eviction rate there became twice as high as the next highest of all of NYCHA. Yes. And they're trying to do it in multiple developments right now. So we definitely have to keep this in mind for NYCHA residents struggling to keep their housing. And we know because of the Faircloth Amendment, they're not going to replace this.
No. And Genevieve, you can go to 26. Okay. March 2016, after a highly contentious debate between whom, well, we're going to get there, New York City passes a mandatory exclusionary housing ordinance offering private developers a chance to build taller, denser buildings than current zoning allows in exchange for setting aside a percentage of units in those buildings as permanently affordable. The debate resolves largely around whether the affordability levels are set by the policy are affordable enough to meet the needs of cities' most vulnerable rent-hardened households. Some also question the need to allow market rate development in exchange for affordable housing. The city doesn't help itself by also announcing 15 mostly working class communities of color to be the first to be rezoned under the new mandatory exclusionary housing policy, going back to New York City prior era of slum clearance, Jack, destroying neighborhoods of color to make way for other development. There was a big rezoning battle in New York City that came to head. And definitely came to head, oh, yes, Carmen, and definitely came to head in Harlem. I wanna make this very clear, very, very clear. Before a developer can come into a community and build anything, they must sit down with your city council person. They have to. So when developers come in and they gentrify buildings and offer 2% affordable housing, 10% affordable housing in a community that is low income, your city council person has to sign off on it. And so when neighborhoods are being rezoned and we're seeing that battle, your city council person already signed it on the dotted line and accepted it to happen in your neighborhood. We're not making this up. It's not about who you vote for. They sat down with these developers and made their decision and had meetings that you were not allowed to be in. And then when buildings are going up is when they say that they're having community meetings to talk about an issue that they already settled on. We just wanted to make sure that we made that clear. And we're gonna talk about that in a little bit. Go to the next slide. Go ahead, Aya.
Cool. Yeah, so 2017 was a big win for the tenant movement with the right to counsel being passed. And that just means that everyone in housing court who needs one can have a lawyer.
Mhm.
And that also started a movement for other cities.
Mhm.
Next slide.
Seattle City Council passes landmark legislation to tax large corporations to raise revenues, my Haitian accent kicked in, guys, dedicated to addressing the housing and homelessness crisis in the city. Meanwhile, Senator Kamala Harris introduces a bill in the United States Senate to provide renter tax credit for qualified families, praised by low-income housing activists as providing badly needed relief for a nation where housing costs have been rising faster than income for years. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and let's just say that Bezos did not like that and was going to do a whole coup in Seattle. I'm just saying. Okay. So in 2018, there was the Opportunity Zones tax incentive for investors, and this basically just means that, again, rich people given tax breaks to go make more money and build in low-income communities, and so this fuels gentrification.
Think
So
about,
Congress.
yeah,
Thank
go
you,
ahead.
Democrats, for voting for this tax reform bill that
Mhm,
literally funneled billions of dollars from poor people to rich people's pockets
mhm.
directly.
Yep. And also think of this as how imperialists divide up nations for themselves. That Congress is dividing up communities with developers and investors for themselves and for their profit.
Exactly.
Okay, 2020, we here, and 2020 can go. But what it has brought is resistance. COVID-19 pandemic brought about a new economic crisis. We now know have massive unemployment, as I mentioned before, 50 million people unemployed. And that's not counting indigenous folks. That's not counting immigrant folks, right? Undocumented folks. And many people are unable to pay rent. There's a growing campaign across the country to cancel rent. These are just images of people canceling rent. And this is what the trains have turned into, because as we know, there is a homeless issue within New York City. And because people aren't on the trains anymore because of lockdown, a lot of homeless people found safety by sleeping in the trains. And then we're penalized for it by the curfew of 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. So that's why I wanted to picture that here. Currently, in the United States, because of the pandemic and local and federal governments failing to cancel the rents, which they can afford to do, you have 100,000 rent strikes currently active since March, since the lockdown of people not paying their rent. Next slide. And now we're done with our little history slideshow. What we wanted to do is show you what it looks like in New York City, the business of displacement, because it is a business, right? And so there is something called the Real Estate Board of New York, REBNY. Esteban's going off. And what REBNY is literally a board that is working in tandem with City Council, working in tandem with the mayor. And that board consists of corporations interested in business and real estate, management companies, brokers, landlords, developers, utility companies, attorneys, bankers, and investors. None of that includes us. So there are people there that have capital interests in what our neighbors look like and don't care about our voices and how we want our neighborhoods to look like. Send that to me now. REBNY works with City Council. Like we said, the developers, the brokers, they sit down with City Council and make these decisions. Oh yes, Chris H is all connected. The mayor is also in the rooms with these folks. Now, how does it break down? The landlords use aggressive displacement tactics. They do eviction processes, right? They raise the rent. They refuse to renew your lease. They refuse to fix damages. They work with utility companies to shut down utilities, meaning a landlord will let Con Ed turn your light off if they want you out. And they'll do it. They manipulate elderly tenants into moving out. Folks who have rent stabilized apartments, constantly harassing them to leave, to move in wealthier residents. How does it look like for developers? Pioneering businesses like cafes and art galleries. So not the whole idea of community economics to allow people who have already been in the communities doing these things to be able to uplift them. They bring in folks who they want because they want the community to look a certain way to have space. They use local entrepreneurs as tokens to further push that capitalist-oriented agenda. Oh, well, so-and-so is part of it, so it must be cool, right? And then they replace small and local businesses with larger corporations. And now because of the pandemic, and a lot of businesses that will never open their doors again, this pathway is going to be very open. And brokers firms that begin the developments also harass homeowners to sell. So when we say cancel the rents, we also saying cancel mortgages, right? Because people who have lived in their homes who no longer can pay them because of the pandemic are the ones that the brokers are going to reach out to and say, I'll sell you your home for $50,000, right? With less worth than what the home is, while they sell it for 2 to 3 million in Crown Heights. Then you have city council pushing the rezoning, which is what we were just talking about in the slide. Then how does it look for NYCHA and the NYPD? Vertical patrols in NYCHA buildings, right? Because broken windows. We need more police to be in poor working class communities. So, Akai Gurley was killed during a vertical patrol in the Pink House, which is a NYCHA building, right? And then because there's more police, that means there's more arrests. So this is helping the prison industrial complex, right? So it's just all this vicious cycle based on capital and not people's needs. And I think that's it, John. I think you can stop it.
Word. All right, so now we're gonna.
Yes.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Kirby.
Okay, so now we're going to allow, and you can definitely finish your thought if you want, because I think
I was gonna go ahead with the next part.
Yes, go ahead. You can introduce.
All right, cool. So yeah, basically we just showed, you know, a little bit of just all the mess that's been going on, how politicians, real estate, and the rich are controlling our housing. And so since they are controlling it, we need to know our rights because they're the ones that tell us what we can do. And then we fight for our rights. So we have expanded these rights as well.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those things are what Elizabeth and Esteban are doing in CHTU.
Crown Heights Union, whoop whoop.
And now they're going to talk to us about Housing Know Your Rights currently, and also some stuff for LGBTQ folks and their rights and struggles in housing. So take it away, y'all.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming. We're so excited to be here to tell you about your rights. You have a right to, well, I'll just say we're gonna go back and forth a little bit, but in New York City and federally, you have a right to a lot of things called habitability. And I'm gonna post a link in the chat where that is a really good resource. So I encourage you to copy it and like save it on your phone and check it out. This is the Met Council on Housing list of all your rights. So you have a right to an apartment that works, like working kitchen, working bathroom, hot water, clean areas of like the common areas, like the hallways and the elevator and the stairwell has to be like clean premises. You have a right to repairs if things break. You have a right to heat. So if any of those things are missing, like it's against the law and you can take your landlord to court for them. Sometimes direct action works much better than going to court, or even better is doing them at the same time. So that's something that the Crown Heights Tenant Union does, is coordinate a whole bunch of tactics. So you remember we had rent stabilized housing. In the history lesson we just had about how a lot of apartments got destabilized and displaced and turned into market rate housing and displaced a lot of folks. So this is still like an ongoing contested place in New York City. So what is what your rights are depend on whether your apartment is stabilized or not. So how do you know if your apartment is stabilized? If the building has 6 units or more, and it was built before 1974. So those two things. If it was built before 1974 and it has more than 6 units, and sorry, one more thing, if the rent is at or below 2733, is that right, Esteban?
Yeah, I think the last one was like 2770 as of 2019. Okay,
so if in 2019, I'll put that number in there, it was 2770, that or below, those are the 3 conditions for being rent stabilized. You get extra rights if your apartment is rent stabilized, but we are fighting to stabilize all apartments. So you have a right to lease renewal if you're rent stabilized. And so that means if your landlord doesn't send you a lease, you can take him to court and get your lease. You have a right not to be harassed. And so if any harassment is happening, and I bet a lot of people are experiencing it, there's more and more right now with the rent strike, document everything. You do not have to speak to your landlord. Get out your phone, tell your neighbors to get out their phones. If they send you emails, like save them. If they send you voicemails, save them. If they call you, even if you're not going to talk to them, just press record on your phone, record those calls. All of that is good in court, and it can help you a lot down the road because it's illegal. So you can take them to court for all of those things. So harassment is anything where they're being aggressive, trying to get you to leave. So if they're yelling at you, if there's like construction, there's something called construction harassment. So if they're doing construction in your building, like at all hours, or not cleaning up, or like there's suddenly a hole in your wall, like neglect becomes a form of harassment. And it's helpful to keep documenting all the things they're not doing, all the times you ask, all the times it's not met. If you make a paper record, another way besides all this, like on your, like saving emails and taking videos, another way to document like their failure to repair things is to file complaints with 311. And the best way to do that is to file a complaint in the morning. And if it's not fixed by the evening, file it again. And that eventually, that starts to hit the landlord in their pocket, which is obviously the only thing they care about. So if you do that, and if you get your neighbors to do that, or your roommates, it starts to add up. And it might get you your repair faster so they don't have to pay these fines. But also, even when they're not repairing it, having that record to show in court someday is also super helpful to you. So you want to you want to make a record by filing complaints by calling 311. So that's a little tip to remember. I want to say, so we heard about how like that incentive in 1993 to destabilize apartments. We had a really big win last year where we that was just one of many incentives to destabilize apartments. And we went to Albany with a huge coalition of housing groups and closed a lot of the loopholes. So I'll let Esteban take it from here to talk about how we did that and what difference it makes. But I just want to say that one of the things we're fighting for before COVID, like since our wins last year, but before COVID, was to stabilize the whole state effectively. And that campaign is called the New York Homes Guarantee. And that would give everybody a right to a lease renewal unless their landlord could show that they had a good reason. But it gets us so much closer to housing as a human right for all New Yorkers. Yeah, Esteban, go ahead.
So you may have heard of that same campaign as a campaign to win good cause eviction, and that can kind of be a confusing way to talk about it. But essentially what good cause eviction does is it sets a standard for the entire state that is less about the amount of rent that can be raised and more about the fact that you gain a new set of rights. Most importantly, you gain the right to a lease renewal. And part of the problem with folks that are non-stabilized is not wanting to rock the boat too much or not wanting to do something that's going to piss off your landlord, and then your landlord's not going to give you a renewal lease. This, you know, what we've been pushing for is the idea that everybody can organize if they have that right to that renewal lease. So it's more than just saying like, oh, it's going to go up 1% or 3% or however much it is. And we'll get to some of that like coalition organizing later. But we were able to end, for example, the vacancy increase, which used to be that a landlord could force somebody out every year, and every year he could add 20% to the rent. And if he reached $2,700 at the time, it meant that the apartment was destabilized. So why not, right? Like if you're a landlord and your only point is to make profit, why wouldn't you do that? You also had a provision that or we actually used to call it the eviction bonus because it was a bonus for the landlord. We also had, I don't know if any of you have preferential rent, but preferential rent was a huge incentive for landlords because they would say that you had a $2,000 apartment, legally speaking, but the market in the area only allowed for, say, maybe $1,500. So in order to get people in that apartment, even though the legal rent was really high, landlords would say, okay, I'm going to let you rent it out for $1,500. And so you run in there, you stay there for years and years. And then suddenly when the neighborhood gets to a certain kind of like level of gentrification and you have more white residents coming in, suddenly it's like, now you have $500 extra tacked onto your rent and they can legally do that. And so we lost a lot of apartments in Crown Heights, at least with that same process. And what we were able to do last year is to get what is essentially a moratorium on that. So basically now it's like not possible for the landlord to actually raise your rent to that legal rent. Whatever you were paying in rent can only go up what the normal like increases are, which are normally like 1%, 2%. So that was a huge win because that was something like close to 30% of rent stabilized apartments. So we're talking about, you know, thousands of apartments. Now we haven't been able to re-regulate those, like they were talking about 150 something thousand apartments that were destabilized. We haven't been able to re-regulate those like en masse, but it is something that we've included in the Homes Guarantee. Now, I'm going to get to a little bit more about what we're doing now with COVID, but finish out the part on rights. You have a set of eviction and squatters' rights as a New Yorker, especially if you're living in New York City. It's a very simple formula. 30 days means you have rights. Mm-hmm. Once you've slept or physically been in a place for 30 days, you have to be taken to housing court and formally evicted in order for them to be able to get you out of that place. So that is a pretty significant law, especially right now with people are, you know, like staying on somebody's couch or you know, like just happen upon a place that had an empty apartment, or you know, your landlord suddenly in the middle of the pandemic decides that they want to not renew your lease. They can't just take you out. They can't. No number of letters, not even the police, can legally take you out of that apartment. Like they have to take you to housing court. And right now, there's a moratorium on evictions in housing court, so nobody can be evicted right now, no matter what. So if you're, I mean, that's only until August 5th at this point. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we're trying to get that extended by at least a year. But as it stands, you can't just be like, your landlord can't just call you up and say, all right, you have to move out by Friday, and then you do it. Like, you have the right to stay there and to be taken through the entire eviction process, which at this point could take upwards of a year because there's such a huge backlog. I mean, the backlog right now means that even people who have not been sued in housing court, once you do get sued, it may be probably December before you're ever going to actually have to make an appearance in court. So it's a significant right that you have to like hold on to and like make sure your neighbors know, because a lot of people don't know. You also have some rights that are enforced outside of sort of like housing court rules. Most of those are enforced by the Office of Human Rights, or I think it's the Commission on Human Rights for New York City. Things like source of income discrimination come up a lot, whether you have like Section 8 or HASA or one of the subsidy programs. It's really hard to get a landlord to rent to you, but it is the law that they rent to you. And I actually have a friend that won like a $5,000 settlement because of Nooklin, which is like a trendy little broker here in the Crown Heights area, denied them an apartment. And lawyers and their staff called for the same apartment and just, said, oh, like, I'm going to pay for it out of my own pocket or whatever. No voucher or anything. And they got the apartment. And so they were able to show in court that this brokerage firm was discriminating against the source of income. So that's a really important, right that is sometimes not enforced actually in the housing court itself. I want to talk a little bit about LGBTQ and in particular, like queer people of color have like a whole set of, we have a whole set of issues that that rarely gets addressed in any of like the larger forums, even like in some of the larger coalitions and the housing movement. I remember that my husband and I got technically engaged while we were sitting in housing court. 8-9 years ago, something like that, because it was just before like marriage equality had actually like been like decided, and our landlord didn't want to put us both on a lease, and they said that the only way that they would put us both on a lease was if we were technically married. And so we were like, all right, we'll do that. And like it's so weird to think of it now because it's not, but like we had to go and get like a domestic partnership, and then we like upgraded that to getting married, and like it was like a whole other process that other people would not have had to go through. This still happens in terms of most of what you get now is really like trans folks are still super put down in terms of housing, in terms of whether it's income discrimination or even like in programs like HASA, and HASA is the housing assistance for HIV and AIDS tenants, and they, even like the people that administer that, whether it's the Human Resources Administration or different nonprofits, like they get away with so much stuff, and it's really a dehumanizing process for a lot of people. And so what I want to make sure that people know is that we have, there are like a handful of good legal services organizations that will help you with that. Like most people have like a caseworker or like somebody that they speak with that handles all of that. And that person has like a really like large amount of discretion as to what they do with your case, and you basically are like at the mercy of that person. And it doesn't have to be that way. You really should be looking for or be reaching out to advocates that can do that for you, because you have a right to not have to feel like your housing is precarious, especially when there's funding and nonprofits and like all sorts of people that are feeding into this system. It's important. I know we wrote on here, Legal Aid is one. I saw that Brooklyn Legal Services and Legal Services NYC has a whole program that they'll take care of all of your, they'll help you with your Medicaid, with your food stamps, with your HASA, with or any other like housing subsidy program. And I think it's important that that we recognize that even like obviously like you have like a scale of like, you know, normally at least in Crown Heights, when you have.
Can you repeat the programs that you just mentioned, Esteban, really quick?
Yes, Legal Services NYC, which includes Brooklyn Legal Services, as it's a legal assistance program, kind of like Legal Aid, but they have an LGBTQ rights like department, and they handle all this stuff like directly. That's how my friend got that $5,000. There was also like a $50,000 settlement over. There was a woman who had gotten an apartment, and when her lease renewal came up, everything was going fine until the landlord actually saw that that she had transitioned and denied her the apartment. And so Brooklyn Legal Services filed the case with the support of the Commission on Human Rights and got her like a $50,000 settlement and the apartment. So they are, you know, like these are obviously like cases that are sort of meant to dissuade other landlords from doing these sorts of things. But the additional factor there also, if you're undocumented, that puts you at like the absolute most vulnerable, but you still have protections. Like your landlord can't ask you about your documentation, for example. Like that's bullshit, and you can call them out on that. And the Human Rights Commission will take cases where that happens. So there's also Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which I know is like I think they said that they were pretty like booked up right now, but they certainly have resources that can point you towards. Most of what we do in the Crown Heights Tenant Union, and well, yeah, let me back up a little bit. So Crown Heights Tenant Union started in 2013. It started with an organization called Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, which had done a lot of the squatters' rights actions in like the 70s, like where they would just take over buildings in the Lower East Side and like stay until they won that building. They started this as a sort of like just like a way to get tenants in the neighborhood of Crown Heights talking to each other, seeing who had what landlord, and it sort of evolved into like a completely tenant-led, tenant-organized group that now is doing like, now we're doing basically not just building organizing where you're organizing your neighbors, but also landlord to landlord all over the city. And then we're like getting more involved in coalition work. So that includes the Right to Counsel Coalition, that includes the Housing Justice for All Coalition. It's been interesting to see because there's a lot of organizations that do this work, but not a lot of organizations that let it be led by tenants. And that's really, I think, the key here, because like we're not a nonprofit. Actually, we don't take any foundation funding. We don't take any funding from politicians, and that has meant that we have a certain amount of autonomy that is really hard to get when you're worried about, you know, where funding's coming from. Now, on the flip side, we don't have any staff, and so like, you know, we're all 100% volunteer. But what we've noticed happening during the COVID era is that there's a lot of people that are either out of work or are, you know, like I'm on disability, so like I have the time to be able to do a bunch of stuff with the CHTU. But like essentially we're all like we run ourselves, and we, you know, if we have expenses, we pass around a hat. And we've been able to, especially in the COVID era, been able to use that to push significantly on our elected officials, and then also on, you know, on the courts to listen to us. So, sorry, I'm going through like a little outline here. So basically, like the way that we do things is a strong tenant association, and I know Roland from Happy Tenants Association.
Yep, we're gonna talk about that.
He's going to talk about it in a second. But so like the structure, the way that we like to organize is, you start with a strong tenant association, which is in your building, and then from that you can go to an organization, something like Met Council or CHTU or Flatbush Tenant Coalition. There's all sorts of great groups that are organizing by neighborhood. Then you can use that to connect to the coalitions and the larger tenant movement. And then you can start organizing against some of these things like rezonings or the rent laws. We've had several, and in the middle of right now, like we sued against the rezoning across the street from me. That's a huge, like, again, like your council member basically is in charge of all of it. Like they can literally like up or down anything. Whether or not they have community meetings is like beside the point. But we decided to fight back against that. So we sued in an Article 78. And so we're in the middle of one of those. But it really helps to have some of that outside push, because it helps with media. It helps with getting your message out. And it also, like, there's a lot of neighborhoods that have gone through this now. You know, there's, you know, we're organizing against everything from RAD, which we talked about earlier, which is privatizing, you know, privatizing public housing, and just anything where, you know, where public land is being given over to private capital, we've been opposed to. I think what's great about the, you know, the slideshow that we just, that Kirby and, is it Aya?
Yeah.
Yeah, that Kirby and Aya did, is like, there's such a strong connection between over-policing and gentrification and displacement. And they try to separate it out. Like even the media tries to separate it out in a way that will focus our energies in different places. And so we're feeling kind of scattered. But it does all come down to the same thing. Like when you're getting evicted, it is a marshal, it is a law enforcement officer that is taking you out of your home. And when you, when now suddenly you have cops going through hallways of buildings and being allowed to do that even, and like, it's just, there's a basic concept that, and this is gonna be a little jolting for some people, but this is what we found with real estate, whether it's Rebney or, you know, Nooklin or anything that has to do with real estate. They have a significant task, which is basically to turn as many neighborhoods that have mostly Black and brown people into white neighborhoods. This increases the value monetarily of those neighborhoods. And it's really hard to hear that, because it's like, we are devalued on a large scale, right? But if we recognize that, then we can start fighting back against it. A landlord sees their building, and if there's half of the people there have been there for 40 or 50 years, and they're, at least in Crown Heights, they're Caribbean or Latino or Black, they think, all right, the more of those people that I can turn over, the safer this building seems. And the safer this building seems, the higher I can raise the rent. And you become just part of their business model. And you have to fight back against that. And that's what we've been trying to do, whether it's like on a state level, citywide level, whether it's dealing with laws or dealing specifically, we had an action earlier today and we just got an email from the same landlord where somebody was trying to kick somebody out, and we showed up en masse with banners and posters and just planted ourselves there and defended our neighbors. You know, that's what we have to do. Because otherwise, like, I feel like even now we've probably had tons of evictions happening in New York that we just don't even know about. And so I'll put some information in the chat as well about what we're doing now with COVID and how we're mobilizing to put together eviction defense and eviction blockades and doing it in a systematic way, which hasn't been done in New York since the 30s. But as it is, 25% of New Yorkers did not pay rent last month.
Right.
25%. That we're hoping goes higher in August, not because we want people to be in debt, but because we need the governor and we need the legislature to see that this is a crisis that they cannot buy their way out of. They're going to have to cancel the rent, and that's the only way that we're going to end up not losing. Like, I think there's something like 50,000 evictions right now waiting to be filed just right now, like not even including August. So all that, I know that's a lot of information, but we're here for questions as well. So like put questions in the chat about anything specific that you have in terms of your own housing situation. But if anything, I think it's a hopeful thing to know that you have some rights, and that to know that even with all these terrible systemic things that are happening, because displacement and gentrification is policy, right? We have ways to fight back against that, and we are learning as we go along. And as long as we keep doing it together and uplifting uplifting each other as we do it, I think that, well, no, that I know that we win. We will win.
Yes. Thank you so much. We're gonna come back to Esteban and Elizabeth in a second. I just want to uplift some of the things that were said, and people did ask about NYCHA. So just so people know, when NYCHA residents lose full or partial income or receive unemployment benefits due to COVID-19 or any other circumstances, you should report the change of income to the management office. The rent should be decreased and will always be 30% of the household income, okay? If a household income is zero, the rent should be reduced to zero. Tell management immediately to keep a record of your request. Also, threats and intimidation of eviction by NYCHA staff and management to NYCHA residents is illegal retaliation practices and should be reported. You can report those harassments to 311. All NYCHA residents are required, all residents, including NYCHA residents, are required to have safe, clean housing conditions. This includes working elevators, full repairs, and thoroughly disinfected and clean public spaces for residents to be safe, which we know that is something that we don't see in a lot of our NYCHA housing, but you absolutely have the right to that, just like any other resident. NYCHA has suspended all planned heat, water, hot water outages until further notice. Meaning right now, just as we have a pause on housing eviction, the same has happened for NYCHA, including for heat, gas, and water. They cannot just cut it off within NYCHA. So I just wanted to uplift some of these things for some questions I saw about NYCHA. If somebody is a month-to-month tenant, meaning you pay your rent every month because your landlord has not given you your lease, as long as you pay for rent in your apartment, you are a tenant. As Esteban said, as long as you are in a space for 30 days, you are a tenant of that space, which is why a lot of homes are really boarded up in community to prevent people from literally climbing in and staying in there for 30 days. But even if you're month to month, you have rights within that apartment because you're in that apartment, you're a tenant. And being a month-to-month tenant, you can take your landlord to court. Does that include any space that you occupy, comrade? Any space that you occupy for 30 days. And just so people know, if your room does not have a window, it is an illegal space. Like literally having a window is a mandatory housing need. That is actually a law. And that is something that you can take whoever you're renting to or your landlord to court for. So be very aware of like your surroundings and where you are, because those things can cause more advocacy on your side. And the reason why we're stressing 311 calls is because when a landlord receives a 311 complaint, they are fined. So every 311 complaint that you make affect their pocket. And so we want to make sure that we attack them like they're attacking us to get the things that we need. And now, again, thank you, Esteban and Elizabeth. Now we want to introduce our comrade Roland. Roland is an organizer within the Taffy Tenants Association. The Taffy Tenants Association has a long organizing struggle that they have been a part of. It is a tenants association that has formed, that has over 200 people in it across 5 buildings in Fort Greene. And Roland is one of those leaders. These comrades are currently, Taffy, T-A-A-F-F-E, Tenants Association. And sorry, I just read a question and you completely took me off my brain. No, it's okay, you're okay. And the Taffy, the great thing about the Taffy Association is that when we're talking about rent strikes, these comrades are literally in one. These comrades have been in a rent strike for the past 4 to 5 months. with across 5 apartments, buildings, literal buildings. So we wanted to make sure that when we're talking about housing know your rights and fighting back, first we want you to know your rights so you can actually fight back, because that's necessary. And then we wanted to show what fighting back looks like. And so we wanted to make sure that we had someone who is doing that work here to talk about that work. So please welcome Roland.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Kirby, for the invite. Some of the people I've definitely seen out at the housing court demonstrations, like Esteban. It's great to see you, brother. And just before I really, before I get into anything, I feel like it's only right that I just tell you a little bit about me. I am a maladjusted person. What that means is I don't address to discrimination, sexism, misogyny, xenophobia, transphobia. Like, it's just, when I see it, I can't help myself. It's in my body. I have to say something. And so with that being known, I was kind of pulled in the very beginning of our organizing here on Taffy Place, right by the 88th precinct. And it kind of started off of this whole unifying idea about our packages kept getting stolen from our apartments. And it started there before the pandemic even happened. We just started talking to one another, and then the pandemic hit. And so that's when we kind of had a structure between like 10 neighbors. And then we decided that, like, oh my God, this is a moment where we know it's going to be affecting a lot of tenants and a lot of our neighbors. And we know that it's very scary and it's very unknown, because everyone just starts going inward and worrying about themselves. And one of the things that was uplifting, especially, as you can tell, I'm not really going to deal with laws because Kirby and Esteban and other people have done a fantastic job giving you the information on that. What we were dealing with was this energy that we saw the future. We saw where this was heading, and we proceeded to then set up Slack channels, set up Signal channels to where we can communicate amongst neighbors. And we had a whole big outreach of where we had flyers made, we knocked on doors, we had Zoom meetings once a week just to get the temperature of people's appetite for a potential rent strike or a potential organizing amongst the 5 buildings. And what we came to find out was that one of the interesting things that put a lot of people at ease is some of the laws that are in place against retaliation. And the laws against retaliation is that if you are in a union and you are retaliated against, that is illegal. So it is better to out yourself. It is better to organize. If you stay in the dark, that's actually against your best interest. When you organize, you have that paper trail. So when you get taken into court, or if they're not going to give you a lease renewal, you can say, the landlord's retaliating against me because they know I'm in this union. And so when we began to understand that, that's when we had more energy behind it. That's when we became a little bit more, excited to agitate, because we know that, oh, we got you now. Like, what? I'm out here. I need help. We asked for help, and you responded in kind by giving us a $50 rebate on our rent. And we already knew what was happening. So we're like, it's all good. We were expecting our landlord to be this way. But what we understood is that if we have grace, if we are gentle, if we are soft with our neighbors, the landlord doesn't stand a chance. because we're talking about giving people an opportunity to live their lives and have peace of mind. And from there, we started growing it out bigger into shared community resources. So if people want to have art supplies, book swaps, exchange hardware tools, we now begin to build partnerships between our neighbors that our landlord cannot divide us, because we now know each other. We watch out for one another. So I'm not going to spend too much time, because I cannot speak to the struggles of what you guys are doing. That would be irresponsible for me. So I was always here just to listen and to hear where people are coming from. And I just want to let you know, it is not safe to be in the dark. Come out into the light, because that is actually more protection for you. And I'll leave it at that.
I just want to say that Roland rolled up to the landlord with his eyes just like that. That's how it was giving it to the landlord. Okay, I just want to mention that those eyes were intense.
Yeah, my apologies. As you see, like, in my association, I'm the flamethrower, and so whenever I see anything, like I said, I'm a maladjusted person. I am content with being maladjusted, because I don't have time for nonsense, and I don't have time for discrimination or injustice. And if we have more things like that, where we can be, as a person who just recently passed away, that I feel like his message needs to continue. He said, be ruthless to systems, be kind to people. Because we know that this system was built to dismantle us, to keep us where we are. And so that's my last bit. Thank you guys again so much for having me. And it's really been inspiring to see this energy amongst neighbors, amongst our community that aren't living here. I'm just glad to see that other people have an appetite.
And just things that I want to uplift about what TTA has done. These comrades have created, they're going to start implementing a legal buddy system. Folks are going to go to court together when their dates happen. They started a system of, when they got representation, where tenants are literally coming together and paying the restitution for that attorney. So every month they're putting money away to make sure that they have representation in court. And they're also, for some of the tenants who did not sign on to that attorney, they're still in counsel with those tenants, and still supporting them as well. So in their organizing, they have become a community. Before, when they didn't speak to each other, when they ran up and down, when they went up the elevator, when the housing situation wasn't their crisis yet, right? They were strangers, and now they have become comrades in struggle. Because of the housing situation and having a slumlord, but also now learning together and growing together. So some of the things that they're also doing while they fight for their housing right and for their rent to remain canceled, while looking through destabilization, right, of Alma, that's the name of their slumlord, they're also doing political education. So now they're learning about restorative justice. They're learning about de-escalation. They actually want ALP members to come in and teach that work. So it's becoming more than just that struggle, which is what organizing does. It becomes more than that one thing that you're fighting for. So, Sai, I see you. We're gonna have links to different housing know your rights that we're gonna post towards the end. So we got you. Now what we wanna actually do, no problem. Now what we actually wanna do is open up the floor to Elizabeth and Esteban for some of these questions that folks may have. Now, the way that we're going to do it, some of these questions that we have written down that were asked before have been answered. what we want people to do is use the raise hand emoji, doo-doo-doo, little raise hand, and Genevieve will click on your hand and you will ask your question, and Elizabeth and Esteban will answer. So we're going to open up the floor.
I just want to uplift one of the questions first, which is to talk more about taking a landlord to court in order to get
Yes. Okay.
So I think we can take that question.
So yeah, actually, let's do that. So let's start with some of the questions that because I'm watching our document wizard here, and I saw answered, so I thought we were good. If Elizabeth and Esteban can talk one more about taking your landlord to court, and two, the second question that is here, if you have eviction proceedings, do you still have to pay rent? So one, the process of taking a landlord to court, and two, if you have eviction proceedings, do you still have to pay rent? And if there's folks that can raise their hand, we can have you take the floor after those two questions are answered.
So, so in terms of taking a landlord to court in order to get a lease, that depends specifically on what kind of housing you have. If you're rent stabilized, it doesn't matter if your landlord gives you a lease or not. Your lease is implied, and you get it by law, regardless of whether you have a physical lease or not. So if you're rent stabilized and your landlord's trying to, one of the things I think it came up also in the chat is landlords not giving a lease because you're on rent strike. Nothing to do with the other. You can be on rent strike and you still have the right to your lease. Now, if you're in non-stabilized housing, that can be a problem, and that's one of the things that we're fighting to change. However, as Roland was saying, once you join with your neighbors, this issue of being non-stabilized becomes less important, because now you have some sort of economic power over your landlord. So you can strike as a whole building, and he may have the right, technically, legally, to not give you a renewal lease, but he doesn't want to face all of those tenants at the same time. And this is an important, just a good segue into a really important concept, which is that the law generally sucks. All right, the law is not made to benefit you. It is made to benefit the real estate industry and landlords. And the things that we win legally are great, but basically direct action is what gets the goods. It's the only thing that really allows us to get more rights and to fight landlords in a very direct way. So I would say that if you're worried about getting a lease or taking a landlord to court specifically, you want to do that with the backing of the people in your building. That's the best way to do it. And again, right now, your landlord can't technically evict you. Now, I don't know in terms of the eviction proceedings, where you are in your eviction proceedings. If you had a case that was filed from mid-March or earlier, then technically those cases are starting to go to trial supposedly on August 6th. But if there's no actual eviction proceedings, well, that's not true actually. I think there's been 716 eviction proceedings actually filed over the course of the past month, but those are stayed. So that means that those proceedings aren't actually going. So there technically shouldn't be anyone in physical eviction proceedings right now. And if your landlord is telling you that you are, they're lying, basically. So yeah. Oh, multiple listing services. I don't know as much about multiple listing services. The question is there a way to know whether multiple listing service is exploitative? Yes, they probably are. And one of the issues that we get with source of income discrimination is that they come up, HRA comes up with these lists of brokers and landlords that supposedly take quote unquote programs. And those lists are not really, you're better off finding through other people, through your fellow comrades, through other people that live in the neighborhood, or if you happen to be unhoused right now, through word of mouth. And I would say you can't really trust that landlords are really going to be paying attention to the law. So you have to do everything you can to get that unit. And once you get it, or once you've actually seen it and you can prove that you can pay for it, then you have a case if the landlord decides they don't want to rent to you for whatever reason. But multiple listing services tend to be really terrible in terms of, you know, like not just exploitation, but also just discrimination against people for whatever reason they decide. They have a lot of power over how they, you know, who they allow to rent and who they list. Always look at what the source is. Whatever the source is, that's, you know, they're going to have the most authority over how that works. What else?
Esteban.
Oh, NYCHA. Yes, sorry. NYCHA has like a separate set of issues which are not, they're not completely different. I mean, like, for example, like you don't go to housing court, you go to, I don't know if somebody knows, somewhere on Broadway, I think there's like the NYCHA process, like eviction process can happen. And so I'm not as familiar in terms of what the rights are, like the basic rights that Elizabeth was talking about, like the right to heat and hot water and basic habitability. Like those are all across the board, no matter where you are, no matter who you're renting from. Like those are your rights. And of course, NYCHA violates those rights all the time, you know? So, yeah.
If there's not, there is some amazing organizing happening in NYCHA, but it might not be the particular buildings where you live, but there are people organizing. So if maybe we can, like, I don't have it off the top of my head, but maybe we can connect you with a good NYCHA organizing group that has all the info. And would Matt know things too, or not really?
There's definitely some comrades that we can connect you with.
Yeah.
And I also know that, you know, the rights that apply are the same. And also what Esteban was saying applies to NYCHA as well, which is that if you don't have a tenants association or coalition, it's just much harder to get your repairs done and all the things that you need done. And so, you know, there's tenants associations in NYCHA that are already institutionalized and are part of NYCHA. And so since those exist, it's a little bit hard to have like autonomous organizing. And sometimes it can be, that's why it's a little bit difficult, I would say, but it's happening and people are taking NYCHA to court and filing HB actions. And also fighting other things like privatization, infill, and the sale of air rights, as well as like, well, privatization, which is RAD, the program we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
They introduced a new program yesterday. I don't know if you guys saw, or two or 3 days ago. Like instead of doing RAD, they're now suggesting, and I haven't looked at the specifics of the program, but it's something called. It basically puts it in a public trust, so that those units can get federal funding again in the way that RAD does, but it stays within the confines of like the city. So basically a separate new organization called a NYCHA Trust would administer the program, and they would be the landlord, and then NYCHA would still own the land under it. It seems very bizarre, and I don't trust anything coming out of this administration in terms of NYCHA, because we've had infill and we've had RAD, and mind you, like RAD was expanded upon dramatically by the Obama administration. Like they made RAD like the centerpiece of their housing agenda. And it's terrible because, for example, you've heard how there's like lead problems, right? Like lead paint problems in NYCHA. And so they appointed a federal monitor, and you can file lawsuits and do all this stuff. That doesn't apply to you anymore once that unit goes through RAD. Now it's under private ownership, and you can't make any of those claims to the federal government. And it's like crazy that they've tried every possible way since Clinton was president to do away with the only real permanent affordable housing that we have in this country. And so, but yeah, it is hard when there's like an institutional, because part of public housing is that it requires that there be a tenant association that operates in the building. Unfortunately, those tenant associations, and this happens also with Mitchell Lama, which is another government program that is for like co-home ownership. What you end up getting is people that are very much doing the will of local elected officials. They, you'll get like whoever the president is becomes like chummy with the city council member, and then suddenly like you get like, for example, this what happened in Queens, which is like the different TA heads were opposed to or were in favor of Amazon coming into Long Island City, for example, where most of the tenants in those buildings were not. They rejected it entirely, but because there's like, you're basically dealing with like a political level now, as opposed to real organizing, it becomes a problem. So you are seeing now like this collection of like people organizing within NYCHA. Community Voices Heard, I think, is one of the organizations that we work with that does some of this, but a tenant association can be 2 or 3 units. It can be 10 units. It can be however many people that you need to fight back. And you can do that in addition to what's already established, by law in your building. And I encourage you to do so, because there's not a whole lot of real tenants' rights happening in those like institutionalized NYCHA TAs. So.
And I just want to uplift and just like, keeping stack of time. Even if your lease has not been renewed, if you're in NYCHA or your tenancy is quote unquote terminated, NYCHA still has to take you to housing court. So no matter what, whoever your landlord is has to take you to housing court and has to prove your eviction. The only person that can remove you from your apartment is a judge's verdict in housing court. That is it. And in terms of NYCHA conditions, they must provide you, like we're saying, with livable conditions. Everything that we were talking about in terms of safety, stability, cleanliness, NYCHA has to provide you, just like any other landlord has to provide you in New York City. You can also have a pet in NYCHA. You can have a dog, and this is within their regulations. You can have 1 dog or 1 cat if you wanted to. They also have to provide every disability necessity for your apartment, for that building. That means they have to have ramps. They have to have handles. They have to make sure it's accessible. And the reason why Esteban and Roland and other people are pushing for tenants associations is that NYCHA is basically a public agency, right? It's a corporation. And so your one voice might not be heard, but if you gather, and this is NYCHA and this is everyone, but particularly for NYCHA, if you gather other tenants who have the same feelings that you have about your building, then you can make a shift. And so comrades in the Answer Coalition and Justice Center in El Barrio with the Fulton houses, I believe, and
Holmes Isaac too.
Holmes Isaacs, thank you. They actually successfully filed the HP action against NYCHA.
Yeah, they're going through court proceedings right now.
Exactly. And that's because they, through a long struggle of direct action, of talking to each other, got to a place where they're like, yep, we're taking it to their institution now. And before NYCHA can continue to attack them by making them live in unlivable conditions, they took the battle to their door. And I don't know if we have one more question. I think we did. Okay. Oh, I think we answered everything.
Yeah.
I just want to lift up one last time what Roland said about coming into the light and your safety being in what you just said, Kirby, your safety being in numbers and in being organized and knowing each other. That is the most important thing, because as soon as you're organized, then it's like all kinds of retaliation every time your landlord does something terrible. Like every time he does that, it's worse for him if you're organized. And you only need like one other tenant to be a tenant association, and then you can build and you can keep explaining to your neighbors that the light is safer than the dark. And like there are lots of ways to, like, direct action makes a landlord feel like it's easier to solve your problem than to be taken to court or than to not solve it. It's like easier to solve it than to deal with you. That's what you want to do. That's how it works real fast.
Yes, we abolish landlords. Absolutely. Looking at the chat.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's how we, yeah. I mean, ideally, we have to take housing out of the field
Profit.
of being a commodity. Like it can't do that anymore. We can't let landlords determine who's going to have safe housing, who's going to be homeless. This is a huge racket, housing right now, and has been pretty much always in the United States. But we're living on stolen land. You know what I mean? Like all of us are living on stolen land. Nobody has the right to, just because it got handed down by their family, have the right to tell you that you can't live there. And the only way that we get to that is organizing. I mean, we need like hundreds of taffy tenant associations and franchise tenant unions all over the city. In Sweden, for example, they started a tenant union movement in the 70s, and now they administer housing. They set the rents. They, by neighborhood, like they're the rent guidelines board. Like the Swedish Tenants Union is like essentially contracted by the government to administer housing as a human right and not as a commodity. So it can be done, but it's a hard fight and we have to keep fighting. I don't know if it happens in my lifetime, but like, I think so, maybe.
Definitely, not for sure. That's a great way to actually end and wrap up. And we wanted to really uplift everything that's been said, because this is not about each one of us fighting our landlord on our own. It's about making the housing struggle collective and building power. And how we do that is by building relationships and trust with both our own neighbors, our roommates, other buildings owned by the same landlord, other buildings on our block, and then grow from there to, you know, all of Brooklyn, all of New York, like nationally. And it's been done, and it's gonna continue being done. And I just want to say, if any of you on this call want to build your own tenants association, like, please reach out or say it in the chat. We will also have a follow-up for all the folks that signed up. We are here to support and do all of that. I just want to say, uplift two things that Franchise Tenants Union's been doing and folks around the city, which is eviction, organizing against evictions. So we're going to be having, I don't know if y'all have the links, but there's definitely ongoing work with stopping evictions as well as disrupting housing court, because we don't want landlords to start eviction proceedings. And yeah, just
I put my email in the chat.
Yeah, email, just like hit up Esteban, like, what's up?
We have a huge action coming up on Tuesday. If anybody wants to like come join us, Tuesday morning at 8:30 at Brooklyn Housing Court. We're going to be basically doing for 3 days in a row to try to stop evictions from happening on August 6th. And we're coming out with like a huge U-Haul full of like stuff. We're going to throw it out in front of Housing Court, and we're going to demonstrate. And then if by the 6th we haven't gotten what we want, we're going to block the entrances of Housing Court and prevent people from being, from these cases from going forward until they do what we want them to do. So let me know.
And other things that we want to uplift is, one, political education. So it's very, very important for comrades to share what they learned today to others, so other people can have the knowledge of what their rights are. We're living in an extremely scary, anxiety-ridden time where everything seems unstable and has no clarity. But the things that we mentioned today are the clarity that we need in terms of our housing. That there are things that your slumlord cannot do to you. And I say slumlord because they're sleazy. And obviously these are not people that care about the safety and for our housing. I have started putting links into the chat. I'm still adding things, so sorry for my pause in communication. Also, organize a tenants association. Roland, who had to get off the call or the Zoom is just one member of TTA. We actually have a few members of TTA that are on the call right now who would be more than open to talk about what it means to organize a tenants association. Myself and Aya met these coordinators of TTA because we have been consulting them for the past few months about how to start their TTA or talks about de-escalation or transformative justice. And we are their comrade neighbors, you know, because everyone should be organizing a tenants association. So we're all neighbors in that. Also, Crown Heights Tenants Union is constantly available. And I met these comrades when we organized a tenants association in a building in Flatbush, a 30 unit building. And that's how we've been organizing. So these are folks that you can plug in with at any time. They posted their email there. We're also working in solidarity with them about a case where a Met Foods owner put a Black community member in a chokehold. And so this is the work that we're doing when we're talking about everything is connected. That's what we're talking about, that your safety is connected to your housing, is connected to your freedom. And that's why we have to fight for all of those things. So we're plugging the links in. And we're gonna wrap. It's 8:05. We made really good time. I want to thank Elizabeth and Esteban from Crown Heights Tenants Union for being on with us. I want to thank Aya for co-facilitating. You could flick your hair to the side because you did that thing. I want to thank Roland, who left, for also sharing their story about organizing a tenants union. Remember that there's 100,000 rent strikes going on right now. And that you can withhold your rent if the conditions in your apartment are dismal, if you are being unfairly charged. I would also recommend, we didn't uplift this, get your rent history. And this is critical because if you get your rent history of your apartment, you can actually find out if your apartment is rent stabilized or not. You can even get the floor plans to your apartment to see if your landlord misused the space to overcharge you. And these are things that we can share with you if you want that information. And I want to thank our safety team, our vibe checkers, our document wizard, our tech people for holding down this space. Just did this now. Thank you, Monica. And helping this happen. Okay, now you giving some stuff. Just fix it. I want to wrap, but y'all keep putting stuff in the chat. Just fix it is critical. That tool right there, everybody should have that thing in their phone. Just fix it will tell you what properties your landlord has, every last one. It will tell you how many complaints your landlord has. It will tell you what type of complaints your landlord has, right? And it will actually tell you who your landlord is. There's some people who are paying rent to like places that they don't know what they are. And Just Fix It is like the spy that we've been looking for. It has all that information. Things that you don't have to look online, it just has it. So that is a critical tool that was created by housing tenants, organizers. So definitely Just Fix It is definitely the way to go. So what I want to do now is have us do we want to do a breathing exercise? I don't know. The energy is so hype. Okay, no, we're not gonna do that. What we're gonna do is I want everyone, how we started and how we want housing to look for us. I want everyone to give one word or phrase of what they learned from this workshop or how this workshop has make them feel. So for example, I can start and then Rumi and comrades, write it in the chat and Rumi can read a few off, but I will say that this workshop has made me feel really empowered to be in this space with all of you for the past 2 hours and learning and growing with you. And Rumi, you can read some off.
Empowered, connected. Yeah, I feel connected. I do. Informed.
Grateful.
Grateful.
Ruthless to the system.
Like, I don't know what else.
Energized, empowered. Hell yeah. I will throw my hat into this.
I feel empowered too. I'm like, yes. Fuck the inspired. Yeah.
Say trouble. That's what I say.
Good trouble.
I'm about to give some trouble is what y'all trying to say.
Exactly. You know.
Radicalized.
Bin.
Informed and energized. Exactly. That's what we came here to do.
Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, this was recorded. This will be shared out as a resource. What I'm gonna do is a lot of these resources, I'm gonna email to everyone that RSVP'd for this event. So all of you will get all this information, don't worry. And we will also share it publicly. Thank you so much. Together we win against the slumlords and against this system. Have a good night.
Hi, thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you so much, Kirby, and everyone for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye.
Try to stay warm, get water.
Stay warm. You mean
I
stay
mean,
cool?
cool?
Stay cool.
That's clear that I
Stay
need
cool, girl. Stay warm.
That's clear. Bye, Pierre. I got your name.
Just grabbing these links.
Yeah, grab those links. I clicked that Just Fix It link and I looked at my building and I was like, oh, never seen that before.
Yay.